We are going to get started right now. There is a link in the chat box for our survey. Please fill that out if you haven't already. You should have received an email a little bit earlier this morning with the materials for today's webinar, as well as the link to that survey and also the links to some of the other events that are upcoming. So that should be in your inbox. Today we are excited to be talking to you, kicking off semester 2 with revenue cycle management and financial best practices. My name is Brianna O'Connor. I am from CCSI. We are the upstate New York partner of the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, who's bringing you the PDA. MCTAC is the combo, or the collaboration between McSilver and CASA. Just as a reminder to everyone, just so you're aware, again, I'm going to probably plug the survey just a couple more times because we really do want everyone's information. If you filled out our evaluation survey in the beginning of semester 1, when we get your semester 2 results, we'll be able to give you a summary of that. If you didn't fill it out yet, we still want you to fill it out because it's sort of the midpoint or kind of semester 2 kickoff survey, and also just so that we can get your feedback. The survey includes not only how was the semester, how was the previous stuff, but also how are we doing for you and what can we do for you more. So we really would like to hear from everyone on the survey. It really takes less than 10 minutes. In the email you saw, even Survey Gizmo thinks it only takes about 8 minutes, and it's probably faster than that for a real person. So hopefully it doesn't take too much of your time. All of our webinars are recorded. They will be up on the MCTAC website where all of our materials are, and you'll receive everything. You've received it before this webinar, and you'll receive the tool in a few days, so you'll have everything that you need. If you have any questions or comments at any time, please chat it into all panelists so that we can all see it and respond as appropriate. And as usual, if you have any questions or have any feedback later on that you want to share with us, our email address is pda@ccsi.org. Hopefully after semester 1, you've started to make some progress and you're becoming better positioned to understand your cost, your quality, and your impact within the broader system of care within which you function. We know that even though it was a 6-month initiative, there was a new topic, a new idea, some new tools and resources every few weeks, and that certainly can take some time to build that momentum and make some of those actionable steps. But hopefully you've been taking some of those steps to integrate what you've learned, transfer that knowledge to others who aren't in attendance, and really disseminate that information throughout your organization. We're hoping that the tools and resources that we've provided have been supportive of your efforts to become performance-driven, and that if there are areas or topics that we're missing or that you think would be helpful to revisit or to make sure that are put on the agenda for the remaining webinars in the series, but you do take the time to let us know that. There is an opportunity to do that in the survey in the chat box, and also, of course, you can always email us at any time. Once you do give us some of your evaluation information, survey information, you'll be able to see your agency's growth and improvement through a kind of a report, a summary report about that. And then, of course, we will be preparing certificates of completion for both semester 1 and the entire PDA for you. Our handy little graphic of a performance-driven organization is here. As you can see, today we're going to be covering financial practices and revenue cycle management in as much detail as you can do in one webinar. Certainly there'll be some components that need a deeper dive, but that's what our in-person session in September will be for. Here's our roadmap graphic so that you can see what's upcoming in our semester 2. So today is revenue cycle management and financial best practices. In a few weeks we have corporate compliance, security, and privacy. After that will be a webinar on contracting and negotiation. And then we'll have an in-person session, as I mentioned, in September across the state in the same areas that we have been having them all along, where we will really take a deeper dive into some of those topics or into the topics around this area that make the most sense. And then we'll move into leadership practices to support change in the second half of our semester. With that introduction, I would like to turn our webinar over to David Wozniak, who's going to be providing the content expertise today and who will take it from here. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Brianna, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. As Brianna said, we're going to touch on a couple different topics here. One is revenue cycle management, and the other is financial best practices. A little bit about myself before we start, if folks are unfamiliar with my work. I've been in the behavioral health business for a little over 40 years now. I started with a master's in rehabilitation counseling and had experience as a substance use counselor, a mental health therapist, and a clinical supervisor. I did that before I went on and got my master's in business administration. Went over to the dark side and began doing have taken on financial responsibilities, and was the chief financial officer for Spectrum Health and Human Services in Western New York for 34 years. I've recently retired from that position, and now I'm a senior consultant with CCSI Center for Collaboration and Community Health. My work has really been supporting behavioral health providers and networks as it relates to their financial operations. We do a lot of work with financial modeling, doing financial assessment, and over the last 7 or 8 years have been doing a great deal of work in data and data analytics, and have a particular interest in beginning to merge some of our financial data and our clinical outcome data to create a model where we really begin to understand the relationship between our outcomes and our financial performance. I believe that's going to be really a critical set of skills that we're going to need going forward as we move into the performance environment. So today we do have a couple learning objectives. I hope by the end of the day you'll gain a better understanding of the components of revenue cycle management, and that you'll be able to use that to identify some of the strengths and weaknesses in your own process. I will be providing, certainly based upon my experience, some of the tools, some of the processes that I've put in place over my career that I found to be extremely successful. Also hope that you gain a little better understanding of financial business practices and some of what I'm calling the core competencies that you're going to need to have in your organization, really around a couple of different domains: budgeting and financial modeling, operational processes and workflows, report monitoring and data analysis, financial infrastructure, and executive leadership. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the second part of the presentation. So let's jump into revenue cycle management, and let's start with a shared understanding of what we're talking about here. It's really all the administrative and clinical functions that contribute to capturing, managing, and collecting client service revenue. You'll see in the next slide that we really describe this as a life cycle of a client account, from creation to payment, collection, and resolution. The client account structure or account cycle is supported by a number of additional activities that we'll talk about that are necessary to ensure that all counters are billable, meet regulatory requirements, and that revenue collection is maximized. So, I've used this a number of times in the past, and I find it it's a very useful kind of visualization about the revenue cycle. And it really is, in many ways, a cycle, and that is longitudinal. It has a beginning, it has an end, it has a number of interdependencies between each of the tasks that are identified and each of the processes that are identified on the visualization. So around the outside in each of the boxes, you'll see the different tasks that we're going to describe in different responsibilities in the revenue cycle. In the middle are those other kinds of processes that are essential to an efficient and an effective revenue cycle, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's take a brief talk. This is in no way designed to be a webinar on how to do billing. It really is a webinar to begin thinking about revenue cycle management in broad concepts, help really conceptualize the process, and so you can help identify where your strengths and weaknesses are. Because as you look at any workflow, particularly workflows that require one task to be done first, then another task, they may be done by different individuals at different times. I find in my experiences that a lot of times you'll get bottlenecks in those processes. It'll back up the flow. It'll lead to all kinds of problems. I think it's helpful if we begin conceptualizing this process in this way. It helps us fine-tune what we need to look at. How do we identify where the bottlenecks are? How can we figure out what is causing that bottleneck? Because it could be anywhere along this cycle, but this sort of segments the process out so you can focus on them more effectively. So we start really in the beginning with scheduling and pre-registration. We'll talk about this more. You need to really have an effective way of scheduling. Long ago, we've done away with individual schedule books where people can schedule their own clients. We really are moving towards centralized scheduling. We also are seeing schedules now made through our websites. A lot of folks have open access, so we don't even really need to deal with the scheduling, but we do have the beginning of the process is scheduling and pre-registration. Pre-registration, some folks are standing up some of their initial paperwork on their websites so clients can download them, have some of the information filled out before they come in. What we're going to be talking about in this process is how we can build inefficiencies, how we can move our clients through our process more efficiently, have them be less cumbersome, and also have us reduce some of our costs and overhead in the process. So we start with scheduling and pre-register, then we're going to move to point of service. And at the point of service is really when the client presents themselves at your clinic. There's a number of activities. If it's a new client, there's all the paperwork. We have to set this up. We take photographs. We have to, there's going to be all kinds of releases and financial agreements and a fair amount of paperwork that has to be done. If it's a client that has been already registered, that process then really focusing on collection of fees. One of the things that is normally a point of contention in this revenue cycle management is the collection of fees. We're seeing over the last 4 or 5 years, as more and more people are shifting over to high deductible plans and our third-party insurance plans, that the amount of money that individuals have to pay out of pocket when they present themselves has been becoming larger and larger over time. That really, in a lot of clinics, becomes a point of contention between clients, between clinicians, between front office staff, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The third piece of this is what we call charge capture and coding. That is really at the point that the service is delivered, that we are actually accurately recording what service was provided, and they're properly coding that to go out on our bills. Medicaid has CPT codes. There are probably in behavioral health 45 or 50 different CPT codes that have to be coded to that transaction properly to assure that you're reimbursed based upon the service that was provided, in some cases the duration of the service that was provided, and in other cases the credential of the service, of the individual who provided the service. So there's separate components that go into the coding of the visit that are important, and capturing those correctly to assure that you're billing the proper amounts is an extremely important part of the process. Once we've got, we scheduled our individual, they've come in, we've collected our fees, the service has been provided, we've properly grabbed that service, it's properly coded in our billing system, and then we have what we commonly refer to as billing. The claim is submitted. Most folks now are obviously submitting their claims electronically, but there's still some paper claims that are going out the door. But that claim submission process, it's certainly important that all services are captured, that proper coding from that service gets on that claim, and those claims go out. I always recommend that claim submissions go out on a regular, scheduled basis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. After the claims go out, you're going to get a remittance back. You're going to get advice from the payer about what was paid, how much it was paid, and you're going to compare that to what you've expected to receive, and then there will be a set of staff that will have to work directly with the insurance companies to reconcile the difference between what you anticipated that you were going to receive for a service and what you actually received from the service. Insurance companies and payers make mistakes. They deny claims because of certain parameters were not met, or they may pen claims, or they may pay you the wrong amount. So really, every single claim that comes back in the door needs to be examined. The amount that was paid needs to be reconciled to what you expected, and then the process of working with the insurance companies to reconcile those variances is an extremely important aspect of this process. At the end of the day, you may end up winning that conversation and will be paid for a claim that was denied, or you may be asked to submit additional documentation, or in some points you will verify that that claim should have been denied and you're not going to receive that payment. But each claim needs to be reconciled and then worked so you're satisfied that at the end of the day that you've maximized your billing revenue. The second to the last process is remittance posting. It's extremely important that we take that remittance, we take that advice from the insurance company, and we post that to our individual client accounts. We will post it to the client, and in that information will be the payer, because these are important aspects of analyzing how well our revenue cycle management system is working, how well our payers are paying, how quickly they're paying, how well our clients are paying, where are our delinquent accounts, and that creates the environment for us to follow up. And the final aspect of this is appeals, collection, and analysis. You may have a process for sending delinquent accounts to a collection agency, or you may have a process by which you're sending out paper bills to folks. And so there's the process of collecting those delinquent fees that is an ongoing process. The last piece of this is your analysis. You really need to understand how well this process is working. What's your denial rate? What are the percentage of services that you provided that you're not going to get paid for? What is causing that problem? How old are our accounts receivable? Do I have a payer that is paying every 120 days as opposed to the 90 days that is required? Do I have a long-term outstanding and delinquent accounts for some of our clients' out-of-pocket payments? What do we do about that? And so the data that we need to understand how our revenue cycle is working as an important component. So those are the processes, those are the workflow. If you think about this, one of the things I'm going to talk about is that the interdependencies, you may have a scheduler who works on the front end. You have your front desk people who may greet and do the collection. You may have a coder on the back end who's taking a look at all these charges and making sure that the code is correctly. You may have a biller who's sending out the claims. You may have a accounts receivable clerk who is doing the remittances. Your finance team may be doing your analysis. You have your clinical staff who may be involved certainly in providing the services, but also may be involved in the collection aspect of this. So when you think about this, we really have these interdependencies that occur and the responsibilities across different work groups, different locations, which really causes some challenges, and we'll talk about those. So in the middle there, you'll see the other aspects or the other of your organization, other workflows, other responsibilities that are critical to this process. Contract management. You have to have contracts with your payers. Your contracts need to be up to date. You need to understand what your expectations are, or the expectations of you are in that contract. You need to understand what credentialing requirements are, what they'll pay you, how much they'll pay you. So management of contracts is an ongoing process that somebody needs to be responsible for. Quality assurance, people think about quality assurance differently. As I think about quality assurance in the revenue cycle management processes are each of the workflows, each of the tasks and responsibilities, are they being done accurately? Are they being done on a timely basis? Is data moving through the system as we expect it to? Are the claims going out clean? That is, are your treatment plans up to date? Are your progress notes signed and finalized? Was the service on the treatment plan? All that oversight that fits into regulatory compliance and the quality of the process are critical because, billing is one thing, collecting is another thing, and your ability to keep that revenue in the long run is something that we don't always talk about. OMIG doesn't have a very high tolerance for errors. So just because you get paid, that doesn't mean that that claim was properly staged from your end. And upon audit, you would not be at risk for a take-back of that. So that's where your quality assurance and your regulatory compliance have to be key aspects of this process. Then utilization review. How are your services being utilized? Where are they being utilized? How does it compare to your staffing capacity? And finally, credentialing. Credentialing is again, another critical aspect of the process. Are your Medicare clients seeing Medicare-eligible providers? Do you have certain credentialing requirements in your third-party insurance contract? Are you lining up the credentials of your staff providing the service with the payers' requirements and expectation? So just to reiterate again, this is a process. It goes through stages. It has a workflow and separate tasks. It involves a number of different individuals across different areas in your organization. And in the center here, we have some critical aspects that need to be taken care of. So one of the ways of thinking about this is phases of revenue cycle. This is a little bit of a reiteration of what I talked about. So we'll work through this relatively quickly. So prior to the service, you're going to do pre-registration. You're going to do eligibility verification, if you can, and authorization. You're going to do some of your scheduling. During your services, we talked about, as a client shows up, you may have new client registration. One of the things you want to think about is how cumbersome is that for your clients. We did a review of our revenue cycle management, and one of the things we did is we had executive leadership walk through the new client registration process to get a feel for that. Are there redundancies? Can the paperwork be streamlined? Can some of it be done beforehand? Do we have an individual in our clinics, this is all they do? Can we use a peer to help with some of the new client registration, answer some of the questions, help with some of the paperwork? How can we process this in a way that is as seamless and efficient for our clients as we possibly can? Eligibility verification, you can do that, batch eligibility. Most of the third-party payers have websites that you can go to verify eligibility. This was an area that probably leads to the most number of denials, where the eligibility is not checked. You provide the service, you submit the claim, but that client was no longer eligible for that payer when you provide that service. So that service gets denied, and it's something that is totally within your control. Collection of fees, we talked about, and charge capture and coding. Following the service, you have your claim submission, you have your payer follow-up, remittance processing and posting, and then ongoing are your analyses and your process improvement. So let's throw this over to a quick polling question, and I'm going to give everybody a couple seconds to answer this. You'll see the poll on the right-hand side. So give me a quick answer. Are you satisfied with your organization's, how you manage your revenue cycle in a manner that efficiently maximizes revenue? This should only take you a second to answer, so we'll leave this up for about 15 seconds or so while I clear my throat. 1 second. All right, so why don't we close the poll down and see what our response was. This usually takes a second for the results to be presented. So we have slightly more, 22 out of 71 who are not pleased with their organization's process. 13 out of 71 are, and 36 of our folks didn't answer the question. So for those folks who are not pleased, let's talk about a couple of the issues here. As I talked about, the revenue cycle is pretty unique. It brings together work groups and staff who may not work together in any other context. There's interdependencies that exist across non-naturally occurring work groups. Revenue generation is obviously a cornerstone of fiscal viability for many of us right now. Inefficiencies, errors, and oversights have a devastating impact. If any of you out there had OMIG visit you and had a significant take-back, you can understand how your lack of oversight or your errors can have a huge impact on your ability to retain your data. And then clinical priorities and fiscal billing priorities are not always aligned. You know, if in fact your finance is beating people over the head about revenues and collecting revenues, and there's not a strong support of that from clinical leadership, you have this situation where the priorities in the organization are not aligned. Sometimes clinical priorities certainly take over, but it's really important that we have the clinical aspects and the billing and revenue collection aspects in alignment. So how might you address some of these operational changes? These are some of the things that I've done in my career that I've found to be very effective. One of the things that's really the most effective is to clearly articulate measurable performance standards for all staff with involvement in the revenue cycle management. So one of the things that we did was we went back and we took each of our job descriptions. We took from that job description, we teased out 5 critical tasks of that job description, and then quantified what our performance expectations were. So as an example, you may have an individual who is responsible for submitting bills. So we may have a critical task, a performance expectation that all bills from the prior 5 business days are submitted by noon on Friday with no errors 100% of the time. So an important piece in that is when you build your quantifiable standards and expectations that you build in your tolerance for error. Sometimes there is no tolerance for error, and sometimes there is, and the timelines that you expect. Then you go in and you measure against these standards. So, and once you measure against those standards, you may find that you have individuals who are not meeting the expectation. It's now your job to determine whether that's a person problem or whether that is a system problem or a workflow problem. So against that biller you may go in and evaluate, and they find that they're just not making their Friday deadline. And you go in and you take a look and you figure it out. It's because they're just overwhelmed, or they're not getting data out of the system in time, or you have to determine whether you have a system problem, and if they're just overwhelmed, maybe you need to hire another biller. If they're not getting the information they need, maybe you need to go one step back in the process and address those individuals. So quantify your expectation, measure against those standards, determine if it's a person problem or a system problem. Give individuals the tool that they need to be successful. And if you're having problems, implement a quality improvement process. And make sure that your executive, clinical, and financial leadership are on the same page. They speak with a single voice regarding revenue and the critical roles and plays in supporting the mission of the organization. Your organization may be primarily driven by grants, and so the collection of fees is not as important. That's fine. But that should be articulated. That should be the standard of the organization. You may be very dependent upon your revenue generation. That's fine. But each of the leadership groups within the organization have to have a shared vision about that. You don't want to give mixed messages to your staff. So probably the greatest tool necessary to support revenue cycle management is a strong billing component of an electronic medical record. There are all kinds of efficiencies that get built into that process. I think one of the critical areas is if your system can, in fact, suspend claims based upon certain expectations or certain parameters. As an example, does your claim go to billing before a progress note is signed, or does your system stop it? So you can't bill anything that hasn't been signed, or does your system not bill out or suspend a claim when the service wasn't on the treatment plan? Are your treatment plan signed up to date? So if you think about this, is if you have a good billing quality assurance structure in your billing system, it can tie back to the clinical components, the clinical documentation components, and really provide you with the assurance that those claims are going out clean. And if they get suspended, then fine, you go back, you go to the clinical staff, people need to finish their progress notes, they need to update their treatment plans or care plans, and so you can address that and make sure that clean claims go out. A lot of folks use billing software because their electronic medical records don't have a good revenue cycle component. That's fine. You need that level of technology. What you don't get with that, with a billing system, is that kind of quality assurance against your clinical documentation. So if that's your case, you need to have a strong quality assurance program in place to make sure that all your transactions or claims are going out clean. So that's a quick run through revenue cycle management. I know that I went through a lot in a short period of time. You know, the webinar is being recorded. The PowerPoint will be posted. Take some time, go back, review, take a look at each of those different components, think through how you're managing your revenue cycle system, see if you can figure out where some of your bottlenecks are, understand what your workflows are, what your system problems are versus your people problems. Make sure you have the analytics to measure effectiveness. You need to know what your denial rate is. That is, how many claims do you submit get denied. You need to know how many claims, how many services you provide that can't get billed out because you have to void it, either through documentation issues or credentialing issues or some other issue. You need to know the age of your accounts by payer. You need to know the age of your accounts receivable by your individual clients. All these will be measures of how effective your revenue cycle management is. So in the second half of this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to talk about fiscal business practices. These are, as I talked about, core competencies for success in a value-based payment environment. They're really core competencies for fiscal best practices, but one of the concerns that I have is as we move more into a value-based payment environment, I think about this as revenue being at risk for quality outcomes. So revenue at risk in the revenue cycle management, as we just talked about, is poor documentation practices, in your poor eligibility verification practices, poor collection practices. That's where you put revenue at risk. We're now adding another component, what we're putting at risk. Now there's 2 variables or maybe even 5 variables that put your revenue at risk. It's important that you really have your core business practices down pat and efficient to assure that you can manage in this environment. And let's talk about how I conceptualize some of these core competencies. So the first is budget and financial modeling. And we'll talk about, we have a tool that we put together to support this process because this is really the cornerstone of practice that I think is critical and is sometimes underutilized. So I'll read through these real quick and then we'll go back and talk a little bit more about that. So when I think about budgeting and financial modeling, it's the ability to identify and quantify costs and revenue variables that drive financial success and use them to create models to set targets and monitor results. And some of the tools that I've used are financial models that are where you can modify the variables to determine benchmark standards, budget against those benchmark standards, and then have a process for getting timely actual to budget data so you can do analysis and see where you are against what your expectations are. Unfortunately, I think sometimes budgeting becomes a chore and it doesn't become a process of understanding what your inputs are going to need to be, what your outputs are need to be, what your goals are, and then using those to monitor your results against those. And different programs have different expense and revenue variables. If you're doing per member per month as a revenue, that's different than a fee for service for a unit of service. Revenues come in differently. Expenses are relatively similar. You have staffing and fringe benefits and operating expenses, and those are really fairly simple to grab and quantify. It's those variable inputs, your units of service, number of clients served, your payer mix, the service delivery pattern against your reimbursement rates, all those kinds of variables that affect your revenue and your revenue generation. And you really need to have a model that allows you to identify what those variables are, to build scenarios that says, okay, let's start with, this is the staff we think we need, here's the number of clients we think we're going to serve, here are the payers that we think we're going to bill, this is what we expect to get reimbursed. At the end of the day, when we put all those variables into a model, does the program sustain itself? The answer is no. All right, what do we go back? You need a model where you can go back and you can tweak the staffing, or you can say, okay, we're going to need to do 5% more units of service than we did last year. Then you can have the conversation about how can we do that. But you should be going into every year with a financial model that identifies what your key cost and revenue drivers are, that you've set goals and benchmark standards against those each of those variables, and you monitor that regularly, timely, regularly. It doesn't do you any good if in June you're looking at your results from January, because if you're already seeing a problem in January, you're in June, you're not going to be able to fix it. You're already halfway through the year. If you can identify problems that you're having in January on February 15th or February 17th, suddenly you have almost an entire year to be able to modify those practices and address those issues. Unfortunately, I find that getting timely information is a struggle for a lot of organizations. The other core competency, report monitoring and data analysis. So this is the ability to create, deploy, and monitor relevant, timely, and accurate data to inform improved clinical practice in financial operations. You'll see I've added clinical practice in there because we're really going to begin in our data analysis marrying some of our financial data and our clinical outcome data. We're going to have sets of data that are going to be, we're going to need to inform our decision making, not only around financial operations, but clinical practice. One of the words I want to point out in this definition is relevant. My thinking is I was meeting with clinical leadership all the time. About data analysis. What do you need to look at? What do you want to look at? People have all kinds of ideas. My question always was, how are you going to use that data to inform decision making? It's nice to be curious, but curious is in terms of data discovery is fine. Curious in terms of standing up ongoing analysis is a huge overhead for very little value. So the question always is, what decisions are you going to base this metric upon? They have to be relevant, they have to be timely, and they, as we look at the tools, they have to be easy to understand. I like to do data visualization. Your information always should be in relation to something else. You should have your data and your metric, how does that compare to what you've expected? How did that compare to how well you did last year? How does that trend out for the year or the last 18 months? All these metrics have to be in a context. They have to be in relation to something else so you can evaluate whether it's good or whether it's bad or whether it's neutral. And of course, you have to have a process in place. Leadership has to regularly review the data and use it to inform decision. Financial infrastructure. So this is more for the accounting guys. You need really a robust accounting system and a good chart of accounts, cost center, structure that lives not only in your billing system, but also in your general ledger system. The work that I do with clients around New York State, I find one of the first things I look at is their cost center structure. You don't need multiple accounts for locations. You don't, I mean, I find that cost structures don't necessarily support reporting. Cost structures are not similar between billing systems and general ledger systems. People can't get data down to the client level. So you really need to be able to have a system where you can record your expenses and revenues accurately. One thing that you don't want is to be making decisions about a program based upon inaccurate data, based upon data that it has expenses from other programs or revenue from other programs. Cost allocations between your shared programs become a critical aspect. They need to be designed well, they need to be monitored, and they need to be reviewed regularly. Revenue cycle management, we spend some time on that. Again, a critical aspect of your operations. And I want to talk a little bit about executive leadership. So this is how I conceptualize this. It's the ability of executive leadership to recognize opportunities, challenge legacy thinking, create an environment of innovation, and use data as a foundation for decision making. There's a lot in there, but I see this as an important role, certainly in today's environment, for your executive leadership. You have to really be recognizing opportunities. Where are the opportunities? Opportunities to provide new programs, opportunities to diversify your funding stream, opportunities to move into new geographic areas for programs that you can create margins on, opportunities to work with other organizations, opportunities to build your infrastructure, opportunities to train your staff. Constantly be thinking. One of the things that I tell people is, it suggests to people is, so you have an opening and you have a job description. In today's environment, before you fill that opening based upon that job description, pull that job description out and ask yourself a simple question. Is this what we're going to need 2 years from now? Always be thinking 18 months to 24 months ahead. Make decisions today that meet your immediate needs and your needs in the future. Review all new hiring, review all new job descriptions. Make sure that you are recruiting individuals who have the skill sets that you're going to need going forward into the future. And of course, as we've talked about, making data as a foundation for decision making. I don't use the phrase data-driven organization. I think that decisions are not always data-driven. We make clinical decisions that are based upon our assessment and evaluation that may not be quantitative. We make strategic decisions from time to time that the data may not support, but it's an important for a goal of the organization moving forward. So I like to think about this as data informed. Your decisions are informed by your data. So if you're making a strategic decision, you understand that you are making this decision, that you may lose some money on this process, but your strategic initiative is more important for the long term for your organization than the decision you're making at that point. But you don't understand that dynamic unless that decision is data informed. So we have this real quick polling question because I'm running out of time a little bit. I've got a couple other things. So we're gonna set this up for about 30 seconds. So how frequently does your organization's clinical and financial leadership review individual program financial performance against expectations? Monthly without fail, monthly with some exceptions, when needed, or ad hoc, or never. So I would appreciate that if you take just a second to pick one of those, get a sense of where people are and how they're feeling about how well data informs their practice. I'll give you a. All right, let's shut this down, Jocelyn, and let's see what our responses are. Again, this takes a second to compile these statistics. Monthly without fail, 8 out of 72. That's a pretty low percentage. Monthly with some exceptions going up to 11. When needed, 14, and then never 4. So as we can see, that is really one of the most important elements moving forward is that you have a process with your leadership, including your financial, your executive, and your clinical leadership, who is reviewing the data, understanding it, having timely, accurate data, and is using that to inform your decisions. If you can't get there in the next year or so, it's going to be a challenging environment for you to be operating in. Okay, so let me show you a couple quick things. So a tool to support this work. So as I began in the beginning, I think that budgeting and financial modeling is probably the critical starting point. We did create an Excel spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheet will be emailed to everybody, and it will also be posted on the MCTAC website. Probably won't go out until a little bit later in the week. I still have some fine-tuning of the instructions, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the components. It's a budgeting and modeling tool. It allows you to set up your staffing budget, individuals, their name, their title, their annual rate, percentage of FTE, their budgeted amount, and then their cost allocation. I talked about allocations before. This is an important element. You need to make sure that you're assigning your shared staff to their programs properly based upon the percentage of effort into each of those programs. Those allocation models need to be updated and reviewed on a regular basis. We have a section in there for fringe benefits. You'll notice in this standard, the yellow is where you do all of your input. We do fringe benefits as a percentage of the gross expense. You'll see in this example, fringe benefits are 27.76 of the gross expense, and they're broken out by these different components. So you'll be able to budget your fringe benefits. Operational expense detail, this is a line item budget. I think it's an important, and I always did line item budgets. You need to understand where your inputs are, where your components are. Some of these operational items don't change very often. You know, your telephone could be stable from month to month. Your electricity could be stable from month to month. But you do have to understand that you have to ask the question, when you're using prior year data to create this, is something different next year that I need to be taking a look at? You have an opportunity to do your revenue detail, and then we put that all together into an agency summary. And then we're going to have a section where you can put in your actual, so you can get your actual to budget analysis. So it has the components of a lot of what we talked about. It's a model. It allows you to set your benchmark standards. It allows you to think through your inputs, your outputs, your revenue, and then it allows you to analyze that on an ongoing basis. This will go out. It'll have instructions related to it, and we'll be talking about that more in the in-person. So takeaways, how do I get started? Take the end of semester one midpoint evaluation if you haven't done that. Meet with your work groups. Ask yourself a couple quick questions. Is your revenue cycle management process working? Is your denial rate under 3%? Do the bills go out regularly on a regular basis, and is revenue posting up to date? If your answer is no to either of those simple questions, then you need to take a look at your process. Take a look at the budgeting and financial tool, determine if it might be useful for you. If you don't already do so, and a lot of you folks don't, convene a regular meeting of your executive, clinical, and financial leadership. Determine what your key financial and clinical performance metrics are and review them regularly. The last thing I'd suggest you to do, take a look at the business intelligence tools that are now incorporated into Excel. They're called Power Pivot and Power Query. These are very powerful data analytic and visualization tools. You already have them on your desktop. They live inside of Excel. They are part of your Microsoft Office license. I will guarantee you, you will not find a better set of tools for free. Microsoft is really working diligently. These tools get updated every month. It's the cornerstone of the work that they're doing going forward. They're also very highly rated. And as a CFO, I love the fact that they were free. So last minute, mark your calendars and register. As you see, the 17th, today was our revenue cycle management. In August, on the 7th, we'll be doing corporate compliance, security, and privacy. On the 28th, we'll be doing contracting and negotiation. That's in August. And then you'll note that our in-person events are Albany on the 11th, Rochester on the 12th. I will be available, and I will be at both of those sessions, including the New York, which is not yet, we haven't finalized a date on that. I will be available to answer questions about the tool, revenue cycle management, any of the business practices, and if you do have questions in between time, although we ran out of time to take any questions today, please feel free to, in a couple minutes or right now, send questions to the chat box, or likely what we'd want you to do is email the questions to us at pda@ccsi.org. Those questions will be forwarded to me, and we'll get answers out to you as soon as we possibly can. I apologize for not leaving any time at the end for questions. We did have a lot of content to cover. I hope I didn't go too fast. I hope that it really stirred your thinking, helped you think through some of the areas that you may need to be addressing to get the data into the environment to inform your practice. So thank you again. Hopefully I'll see you either in New York or Rochester or Albany in September. Take care, and thank you very much.